The silence in the abandoned Meridian Research Institute hung thick as morning fog, broken only by the soft crunch of broken glass beneath Zephyra's worn boots. She paused at the threshold of what had once been the facility's vast library, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. 3 years had passed since the outbreak transformed civilization into scattered pockets of survivors and wandering hordes of the infected, yet this place remained eerily untouched by the chaos that had consumed the world beyond its walls. Zephyra adjusted the weight of her supply pack and stepped carefully into the cavernous room. Towering shelves stretched toward the vaulted ceiling, their contents largely intact despite the apocalypse that had ravaged everything else. Books, research journals, and data archives sat undisturbed, as if waiting patiently for someone to return and continue the work that had been so abruptly abandoned. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had come here seeking answers about the very plague that had made this sanctuary necessary. Her mission was simple in concept, complex in execution. Dr. Orion Valdris, her former colleague and the closest thing to family she had left, believed that somewhere in these archives lay the key to understanding the neurological changes that occurred during infection. Not a cure, they had long since abandoned such naive hopes, but perhaps something that could explain why some of the infected retained fragments of their former selves while others became nothing more than mindless predators. The morning light filtered through grimy windows, casting long shadows between the stacks. Zephyra had chosen this early hour deliberately, knowing that the infected typically sought shelter during daylight hours. She moved methodically through the aisles, scanning for the neurological research section, her footsteps muffled by years of accumulated dust. The beam of her flashlight danced across faded spine labels, cognitive behavioral analysis, synaptic response studies, memory retention in degenerative conditions. She was reaching for a promising volume when the sound froze her blood, a soft, deliberate page-turning that definitely hadn't come from her own movements. Zephyra's hand instinctively moved to the knife at her belt, though she forced herself to remain perfectly still. The sound came again, rhythmic and purposeful, emanating from somewhere deeper in the library's maze-like interior. Every survival instinct screamed at her to flee. In 3 years of navigating this dangerous new world, she had learned that unexpected sounds meant death more often than not. But something about this particular noise gave her pause. The infected she had encountered before moved with erratic, violent energy, stumbling, crashing, destroying everything in their path. This sound suggested something else entirely: control, intention, perhaps even literacy. Curiosity warred with caution as Zephyra crept toward the source of the disturbance. She passed through sections devoted to psychology, philosophy, and finally approached an alcove dedicated to medical journals. The page-turning had stopped, replaced by an even more unsettling sound, what appeared to be quiet, frustrated muttering. Not the incoherent groans she associated with the infected, but actual words, though too soft to understand. As she rounded the final corner, Zephyra's breath caught in her throat. Seated at a small reading table, hunched over an open journal, was a figure that defied every assumption she had about the infected. The person, for despite the telltale pallor and visible decay, person seemed the appropriate term, wore the remnants of a lab coat and wire-rimmed glasses that sat askew on a partially decomposed nose. Most remarkably, they appeared to be reading with genuine comprehension, occasionally lifting a skeletal finger to trace passages of particular interest. Zephyra remained frozen, torn between fascination and terror. This violated everything she thought she knew about the infection. The creature before her showed none of the aggressive hunger that characterized the infected. Instead, it demonstrated a level of cognitive function that should have been impossible given the advanced state of physical decay evident in its form. The figure suddenly stiffened, as if sensing her presence, and slowly raised its head. When their eyes met, Zephyra felt as though the world had shifted on its axis. The creature's gaze held an unmistakable intelligence, though tinged with a profound sadness that seemed to emanate from somewhere far deeper than mere physical deterioration. For several heartbeats, neither moved, each assessing the other with a caution born of hard-won survival instincts. The infected individual, though that term felt increasingly inadequate, carefully closed the journal and placed both hands flat on the table in what Zephyra recognized as a deliberately non-threatening gesture. When he spoke, his voice was rough and labored, as if the mechanics of speech required tremendous effort, but the words were clear and purposeful. "Please, don't be afraid." The sentence emerged in careful, measured tones, each syllable precisely formed despite the obvious difficulty. "I mean, no harm." Zephyra's hand remained on her knife, though she found herself unable to draw it. Everything about this encounter contradicted her understanding of the infected. She had seen thousands of them over the past 3 years, mindless, violent creatures driven by an insatiable hunger for living flesh. Yet here sat someone who not only retained the capacity for speech but seemed genuinely concerned about frightening her. "You're..." she began, then stopped, unsure how to complete the sentence. What was he? Infected, certainly, but the implications of his apparent self-awareness raised questions that challenged the very foundation of everything she thought she knew about the plague. "Infected, yes," he replied, apparently reading her unfinished thought. "But not, like the others." He gestured slowly toward the journal before him. "I've been trying to understand what happened to me. To us." His eyes held a desperate hope that was almost more frightening than any mindless hunger would have been. "Are you a researcher?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with possibilities that both thrilled and terrified Zephyra. She found herself nodding before conscious thought could intervene. "Neurological research. I'm looking for answers about the infection's impact on brain function." Something like relief flickered across his deteriorated features. "Then perhaps, we can help each other." He gestured toward the empty chair across from him with movements that were deliberate but careful, as if he were acutely aware of how his appearance might affect her. "My name was Kalen. Dr. Kalen Morse. I worked here before." Zephyra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. Dr. Kalen Morse had been one of the lead researchers on the very project that Orion had sent her to investigate. She had read his papers, studied his methodologies, even disagreed with some of his conclusions in academic forums. The man before her was a legend in their field, though she had assumed he died in the initial outbreak like so many others. "You're supposed to be dead," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. A sound that might have been laughter emerged from his throat, though it carried no humor. "In every way that matters. I am." He looked down at his hands, studying the visible decay with clinical detachment. "But something in me persists. Consciousness, memory, the ability to reason. I've been trying to understand why." Zephyra slowly approached the table, her scientific curiosity finally overriding her fear. This was the discovery of a lifetime, a chance to study the infection from the perspective of someone experiencing it firsthand. Yet as she looked into Kalen's eyes, she saw not a research specimen but a person trapped in an impossible situation, clinging to his humanity against overwhelming odds. "How long have you been like this?" she asked, settling carefully into the chair across from him. 3 years, 2 months, 16 days, he replied immediately. "I remember the exact moment. I was working late, reviewing test results, when the first wave of infected broke through the facility's security. I tried to help my colleagues evacuate, but..." He paused, and Zephyra saw his hands tremble slightly. "I was bitten while helping others escape. I locked myself in here, expecting to become like them. But I didn't. Not completely." The implications of his words sent her mind racing. If Kalen had retained his consciousness for over 3 years, it suggested that the infection's effects weren't uniformly devastating. There might be variants, individual differences, or even environmental factors that influenced the outcome. As the initial shock of their encounter began to fade, Zephyra found herself studying Kalen with the analytical mind that had served her throughout her research career. Despite the obvious signs of physical decay, his cognitive functions appeared remarkably intact. He spoke with the same precise diction she remembered from his recorded lectures, and his eyes tracked her movements with an intelligence that was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. "You've been alone here for 3 years," she asked, her voice softer now, touched by an empathy she hadn't expected to feel. Kalen nodded slowly. "Alone with books, journals, and questions I cannot answer." He gestured toward the stacks surrounding them. "I've read everything in the neurological section twice, searching for some explanation of what I've become. The physical decay continues, but my mind, my sense of self, it endures." Zephyra leaned forward, her scientific excitement beginning to overcome her initial fear. "Have you documented your experiences? Tracked the progression of symptoms, cognitive changes, anything that might help us understand the variance in infection outcomes?" For the first time since their conversation began, something resembling a smile crossed Kalen's features. "Dr. Zephyra Selim, I presume? I've read your work on synaptic adaptation in extreme conditions. Brilliant research." He paused, seeming to gather his strength. "And yes, I've maintained detailed records. Though I must warn you, they make for disturbing reading." The fact that he knew her name shouldn't have surprised her. The neurological research community had been small and tightly connected before the outbreak, but it added another layer of surreal familiarity to their impossible conversation. She was speaking with a colleague, someone she had respected professionally, who happened to be experiencing a condition that by all rights should have stripped him of everything that made him human. "I need to see those records," she said, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil churning within her. "Dr. Valdris, Orion, sent me here hoping to find answers. If you've been documenting your experience. Orion is alive?" Kalen's voice carried a note of desperate hope that made Zephyra's chest tighten. "We were friends before this. He was always the optimist among us, believing that science could solve any problem given enough time and data." "He's alive, and he's still searching for answers," Zephyra confirmed. "He established a research community about 200 miles south of here. We've been studying the infection, trying to understand its mechanisms, but we've never had access to a subject who could." She gestured helplessly, struggling to find appropriate words. "Who could describe the experience from the inside," Kalen finished. "I understand. In my more objective moments, I recognize what an unprecedented opportunity one represent." His expression darkened. "In my darker moments, I wonder if this extended consciousness is simply another form of torture." The weight of his words settled between them like a physical presence. Zephyra found herself grappling with questions that extended far beyond the purely scientific. What did it mean to be human when your body was failing but your mind remained intact? How did someone maintain their sense of identity while trapped in a form that represented humanity's greatest fear? "The records are hidden in my former office," Kalen continued, his voice growing stronger as they discussed practical matters. "I've been careful to avoid other survivors. Most would not react as rationally as you have." Zephyra nodded, understanding the terrible isolation his situation must have created. To be feared and hunted by the very people he had once worked alongside, while simultaneously being unable to join the mindless hordes that shared his physical condition, represented a unique form of hell. "There's something else," Kalen said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something I discovered about the infection that I've been afraid to document, afraid to believe myself." He met her eyes with an intensity that made her lean closer despite her instinctive caution. "I think there are others like me. Hidden, afraid, but aware. The infection doesn't always destroy consciousness completely. Sometimes it just traps it." The revelation hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Zephyra felt her understanding of the post-outbreak world shifting once again as she considered the implications of Kalen's words. If there were others like him, conscious beings trapped in infected bodies, then everything the survivor communities believed about the nature of the plague required fundamental reconsideration. "How do you know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Have you seen others?" Kalen's expression grew distant, as if he were looking through her rather than at her. Not seen, exactly. But I've heard things. Sounds from the city at night that don't match the typical, feeding behaviors. Patterns of movement that suggest intention rather than mere hunger. And once. He paused, seemingly reluctant to continue. Once, I thought I heard someone crying. The image his words conjured was almost too heartbreaking to contemplate. Zephra found herself imagining scattered individuals throughout the abandoned world, each trapped in their own personal nightmare of consciousness without community, awareness without acceptance. How many might be hiding in the shadows, afraid to reveal themselves for fear of being destroyed by the very people they had once called neighbors, friends, or family? "Why haven't you tried to find them?" she asked. "Because I'm a coward," Kalen replied with brutal honesty. "Because I'm terrified that if I leave this sanctuary, I'll either be killed by survivors who won't listen long enough to realize what I am, or I'll lose what remains of myself to whatever force drives the others to such violence." He looked down at his hands again, studying them as if they belonged to someone else. "And because I'm afraid that approaching others like me might trigger something that would make me become what everyone believes I already am." Zephra felt a profound sadness settling over her, not just for Kalen but for all the potential individuals like him who might be scattered across the wasteland, each believing themselves utterly alone. The tragedy wasn't just the loss of civilization, but the possibility that consciousness and humanity might be surviving in forms that couldn't be recognized or accepted. "Tell me about your daughter," she said suddenly, the words emerging from an intuition she couldn't quite explain. Kalen's entire body went rigid, and for a moment, Zephra wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken pain, before he finally spoke in a voice that was barely audible. "How did you know about Thessaly?" "Your office," Zephra said gently. "Orion showed me photos from before the outbreak. You had pictures of a little girl on your desk. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. Tears began to form in Kalen's eyes, actual tears, which somehow surprised Zephra more than anything else he had done. The sight of this deteriorated figure weeping for a lost child drove home the fundamental truth that consciousness, emotion, and love could apparently survive even the most devastating physical transformation. "She was 9, he whispered. 9 years old and the most brilliant, curious child you've ever seen. She wanted to be a scientist like her father. She used to visit the lab sometimes, asking questions that made me realize how much I had forgotten about wonder." His voice broke completely. "I don't know what happened to her. Her mother took her away from the city when the outbreak began, but I never found out if they made it to safety." The raw grief in his voice was more human than anything Zephra had experienced in years. She found herself reaching across the table without conscious thought, covering one of his deteriorated hands with her own. The gesture surprised them both, but she didn't pull away. "I've spent 3 years wondering," Kalen continued, his voice steadier now but filled with endless pain. "Wondering if she's alive somewhere, growing up in this broken world. Wondering if she would recognize what her father has become. Wondering if she would be afraid of me, or if somehow she would understand that the person who loved her is still here, trapped inside this thing." Zephra squeezed his hand gently, feeling the strange mixture of cold flesh and warm emotion. Children see things differently than adults sometimes. They're often more accepting of what seems impossible. "I tell myself that," Kalen said. "In my better moments, I imagine finding her, explaining what happened, maybe even helping her understand the science behind it. But then I look in any reflective surface and see what I've become, and I wonder if the kindest thing might be for her to believe I died in the initial outbreak." The weight of Kalen's confession settled between them like shared grief, creating an intimacy that transcended the bizarre circumstances of their meeting. Zephra found herself seeing past his physical deterioration to the profound emotional struggle beneath, recognizing in him a depth of suffering that was uniquely human in its complexity. "You can't give up hope," she said, surprised by the conviction in her own voice. "If there are others like you, if consciousness can survive this infection, then there's a chance she could understand." Children adapt to impossible things better than we do sometimes. Kaelin looked at her with something that might have been gratitude mixed with desperate longing. You speak as if you have experience with such situations. Zephyra hesitated, then decided that their unprecedented conversation had moved beyond normal boundaries of privacy. I do, in a way. My younger brother was born with a severe neurological condition that left him unable to communicate in conventional ways. Everyone assumed he couldn't understand what was happening around him, but I learned to recognize signs that his consciousness was intact, trapped behind barriers that others couldn't see. She paused, remembering. He taught me that awareness can exist in forms we don't recognize, and that connection is possible even under the most unlikely circumstances. What happened to him? Kaelin asked gently. He died just before the outbreak, Zephyra said. Natural causes, finally. But he lived longer than anyone predicted, and he was happy in ways that defied medical explanation. She met Kaelin's eyes directly. I learned from him that the human spirit is more resilient than we imagine, and that love can survive almost any physical limitation. They sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, each lost in memories of loss and connection. Finally, Kaelin spoke again, his voice carrying a new note of determination. Would you consider taking a message to Orion? To your research community? Not about me specifically, but about the possibility that consciousness might survive infection more often than we believed? Zephyra nodded immediately. Of course. But I think you should consider something else entirely. She took a deep breath, knowing her next words would either offer hope or devastate him further. Come with me. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge to the natural order of their world. Kaelin stared at her with an expression of such profound shock that she wondered if she had finally pushed their interaction beyond the bounds of possibility. You can't be serious, he said finally. I'm infected. Your people would try to destroy me before I could speak a word in my own defense. Not if I vouch for you, Zephyra replied, her mind racing through the logistics of what she was proposing. Not if I explain what you are, what you represent for our understanding of the infection. Orion isn't like most survivors, he's still a scientist first. If I could demonstrate that you're conscious, that you're still yourself. And if you're wrong? Kaelin asked. If they react with fear rather than curiosity? I would be destroyed, and you would be branded as someone who consorts with the infected. Your own safety would be compromised. Zephyra considered his words carefully, recognizing the very real risks of what she was suggesting. The survivor communities had built their entire existence around the principle that the infected were irredeemably lost, that mercy killing was both a practical necessity and a moral obligation. Introducing Kaelin to that worldview would challenge everything they believed about survival in the post-outbreak world. There's another possibility, she said slowly, an idea forming as she spoke. What if we could find the others you mentioned? If we could document multiple cases of retained consciousness, create undeniable evidence that awareness can survive infection, it would be harder for anyone to dismiss as an anomaly. Kaelin's eyes widened as he considered her proposal. You're suggesting we actively search for infected individuals who might be hiding their consciousness. The dangers involved would be enormous, Zephyra agreed. But so would the potential rewards. If we're right, if there are others like you scattered throughout the wasteland, then we might be able to establish communication networks, create safe spaces for conscious infected individuals, maybe even begin to bridge the gap between survivor communities and those who retain their humanity despite physical transformation. The scope of what she was proposing seemed to energize Kaelin in ways that their earlier conversation hadn't. For the first time since their meeting began, she saw something approaching excitement in his deteriorated features. It would require careful planning, he said, his scientific mind engaging with the problem. Methods for identifying consciousness without triggering defensive responses, protocols for safe contact, documentation procedures that would convince skeptical communities. Exactly, Zephyra said, feeling her own excitement building. This could be the beginning of something unprecedented, a new understanding of what it means to be human in a world where the boundaries between life and death, consciousness and decay, have been fundamentally altered. Over the following hours, their conversation evolved from tentative dialogue to earnest collaboration. Kalen retrieved his hidden research journals, revealing meticulous documentation of his experiences that read like a medical horror story written from the inside. Page after page detailed the progression of physical decay, the strange preservation of mental faculties, and most heartbreakingly, his ongoing emotional responses to isolation and loss. The most difficult aspect isn't the physical deterioration, he explained as Zephyra studied his notes. It's the constant awareness of what I've become, coupled with the knowledge that expressing that awareness would likely result in my immediate destruction. His voice carried a weariness that seemed to encompass years of careful hiding. I've developed an entire repertoire of behaviors to avoid detection, staying motionless during daylight hours, moving only when necessary, avoiding any actions that might suggest intelligence to potential observers. Zephyra found herself marveling at the psychological strength required to maintain such discipline. Most people would have gone insane under the isolation and constant fear, yet Kalen had somehow preserved not only his sanity but his scientific objectivity. His journals included detailed observations about the infected hordes that wandered past the institute, noting behavioral patterns that suggested varying levels of cognitive function. "Look at this entry," she said, pointing to a passage dated several months earlier. "You describe a group of infected that appeared to be cooperating, working together to solve a problem." Kalen nodded grimly. "I watched them for hours through the upper windows. They were trying to reach something on a high shelf in the building across the courtyard. Rather than randomly grasping or climbing, they actually formed a human pyramid of sorts. It was crude, but it demonstrated planning, cooperation, and problem-solving abilities that shouldn't exist if the infection completely destroys higher brain function." The implications were staggering. If infected individuals could cooperate and problem-solve, it suggested that the line between conscious and unconscious infected might be more blurred than anyone had imagined. Perhaps consciousness existed on a spectrum among the infected, with individuals like Kalen representing the highest level of preservation rather than a unique anomaly. "We need to test this hypothesis," Zephyra said, her scientific training taking over. "If there are varying degrees of consciousness among the infected, there might be ways to identify and communicate with those who retain higher cognitive functions." "I've been thinking about that for months," Kalen replied, flipping to a section of his journal filled with theoretical frameworks and experimental designs. "The challenge is developing contact protocols that don't trigger aggressive responses while still allowing for meaningful interaction." As they worked through the complexities of their proposed research, Zephyra found herself forgetting entirely that she was collaborating with someone who should have been her natural enemy. Kalen's mind remained as sharp as ever, his scientific insights as valuable as they had been before his infection. The conversation felt like the academic partnerships she had cherished before the world ended, intellectually stimulating, emotionally engaging, and filled with the excitement of potential discovery. "There's something else we need to consider," Kalen said during a brief pause in their planning. "If we're successful in identifying and communicating with other conscious infected individuals, we'll be creating a community that exists outside the boundaries of both survivor enclaves and mindless hordes. The social and political implications could be as significant as the scientific ones." Zephyra nodded, recognizing the truth in his observation. They weren't just proposing research, they were potentially laying the groundwork for a new type of society, one that challenged fundamental assumptions about identity, humanity, and survival in the post-outbreak world. It would require careful diplomacy, she agreed. Both survivor communities and conscious infected individuals would need time to adjust to the idea that cooperation might be possible. "Assuming they want cooperation," Kalen said quietly. "I've had 3 years to come to terms with my condition, but others might react differently. Some might embrace the opportunity for connection, while others might prefer to remain hidden rather than risk exposure." The afternoon light filtering through the library windows had begun to fade, casting longer shadows between the stacks. Zephyra realized with surprise that she had spent an entire day in conversation with an infected individual without experiencing a moment of fear or revulsion. Instead, she felt energized by their collaboration and deeply moved by Kalen's courage in maintaining his humanity against impossible odds. "Before we go any further with this planning," she said, "I need to ask you something personal. Are you prepared for what might happen? If we succeed in establishing contact with the survivor communities, your existence will become public knowledge. There will be people who want to study you, others who want to destroy you, and many who simply won't know how to process what you represent." Kalen was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the thoroughness she had come to expect from him. "I've been alone for 3 years," he said finally. "If there's even a small chance that this work could help others like me, or that it might lead to understanding rather than fear, then yes, I'm prepared to take that risk." As evening approached, Zephyra and Kalen had developed the framework for what they both recognized as potentially revolutionary research. Their plan involved a careful, systematic approach to identifying and contacting conscious infected individuals, beginning with areas Kalen had identified as showing signs of organized behavior. It was ambitious, dangerous, and filled with unknowns, but it offered hope for understanding that neither had imagined possible when their day began. The first step should be establishing a secure communication protocol, Kalen suggested, his voice growing hoarse from their extended conversation. "If I can make contact with even one other conscious infected individual, we can begin to develop methods for safe interaction and documentation." Zephyra agreed, though she recognized the enormous risks involved. "I'll need to return to our community first, to discuss this with Orion and prepare the ground for what we're proposing. The last thing we want is for you to approach our settlement and be attacked before anyone realizes what you are." The practical challenges of their collaboration were becoming apparent as they discussed logistics. Kalen couldn't simply walk into a survivor community, and Zephyra couldn't abandon her responsibilities to her research team without explanation. Yet both felt the urgency of their potential discovery weighing on them. "There's a radio in my old office," Kalen said. "It still receives transmissions, though I've never dared to send any. If your community uses radio communication, we might be able to establish regular contact that way." "We do," Zephyra confirmed, feeling a surge of relief at the practical solution. "We could set up scheduled check-ins, share research findings, coordinate our efforts without requiring physical meetings until we're ready for that step." As they finalized their communication plans, the weight of their impending separation began to settle over both of them. For Kalen, their conversation had been the first meaningful human contact he'd experienced in 3 years. For Zephyra, it had been a profound reminder that humanity could survive in forms she had never imagined. "I have to ask," she said as they prepared to part ways. "How do you maintain hope? How do you keep going when everything seems impossible?" Kalen was quiet for a moment, seeming to draw from some deep well of strength that had sustained him through years of isolation. "I think about Thessaly," he said simply. "I think about the possibility that somewhere in this broken world, she's growing up with questions about science and life and the nature of consciousness. And I tell myself that maybe, someday, the work we're beginning today might help her understand that her father never stopped being her father, regardless of what happened to his body." The simple honesty of his answer struck Zephyra with unexpected force. Love, she realized, was perhaps the most resilient human trait of all, capable of surviving physical transformation, social isolation, and even the apparent death of the beloved. Kalen's love for his daughter had kept him human in ways that medical intervention never could have. "She would be proud of you," Zephyra said with conviction. "Whatever happened to her, wherever she is, the father she remembers would be proud of the man who chose to help others rather than surrender to despair." Tears formed in Kalen's eyes again, but this time they seemed to carry hope rather than merely grief. "Thank you," he whispered. "For listening, for believing, for seeing possibilities where I had only seen endings." As Zephyra prepared to leave the library, both of them understood that they were embarking on something unprecedented. Their work would challenge assumptions held by every survivor community, potentially revolutionize understanding of the infection, and quite possibly put both of their lives at risk. Yet neither hesitated in their commitment to the path they had chosen. "I'll contact you within a week," Zefra promised, shouldering her pack and checking her equipment. "Same frequency Orion uses for our research calls. Are you sure you'll be safe here until then?" "I've been safe here for 3 years," Kalen replied with something approaching his old confidence. "I can manage a little longer. Besides, I have work to do now, protocols to develop, observations to document, hope to nurture." Their farewell carried the weight of new beginnings rather than endings. As Zefra made her way back through the darkening library, she carried with her not just research data but a fundamentally altered understanding of what survival might mean in their changed world. 3 months later, Zefra stood in the communications center of the Meridian research community, listening to a radio conversation that would have been unimaginable when she first entered that abandoned library. Kalen's voice crackled through the static, but he wasn't alone on the transmission. 2 other voices joined the conversation, Elena Vasquez and Marcus Chen, both conscious infected individuals who had been located and safely contacted through the protocols she and Kalen had developed. "The integration process is proceeding better than we hoped," Elena's voice reported. "The children in this settlement seem particularly adaptable to our presence, especially when they understand we're here to help with their education rather than to threaten anyone." Orion Valdris stood beside Zefra, shaking his head in wonder at developments that had challenged every assumption their community held about the post-outbreak world. "I never imagined we'd be discussing curriculum development with infected individuals," he murmured, though his tone carried admiration rather than concern. The success of their initial contact protocols had led to discoveries that revolutionized their understanding of the infection. They had identified 17 conscious infected individuals across a 300-mile radius, each with their own story of survival and adaptation. More importantly, they had established 3 trial communities where conscious infected individuals worked alongside uninfected survivors, sharing knowledge and resources in ways that benefited everyone involved. "Kalen, any word from the northern settlements?" Zefra asked into the radio microphone. "Positive responses from 2 more communities," came his reply. "They're willing to participate in the education exchange program, particularly since Dr. Vasquez demonstrated her expertise in hydroponic farming. It seems that survival needs override fear when practical benefits are clearly demonstrated." The transformation in Kalen's situation had been remarkable to witness. Within weeks of their first contact, he had become the unofficial coordinator of conscious infected individuals, using his research background to develop communication networks and cooperation protocols. More personally, he had begun searching actively for his daughter, using the expanded network of contacts to spread word and gather information. "There's something else," Kalen's voice continued, carrying a note of excitement that made Zefra lean closer to the radio. "We received a transmission yesterday from a survivor group about 200 miles northeast. They mentioned a young woman, early 20s, who's been asking questions about neurological research and whether anyone remembers a Dr. Kalen Morse." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. Zefra felt her breath catch as she considered the implications of Kalen's words. After 3 years of uncertainty, there might finally be news of Thessaly. "The description matches," Kalen continued, his voice thick with emotion. "They described her as brilliant, curious, and determined to understand the science behind the outbreak. She's apparently been developing education programs for children in survivor communities, helping them process the trauma of their experiences through scientific understanding." Zefra smiled, recognizing in that description the child who had once visited her father's laboratory with endless questions about the world. Thessaly had grown up to embody the very qualities that had made her father extraordinary: intellectual curiosity, compassion for others, and the belief that understanding could triumph over fear. "Are you planning to make contact?" Orion asked into the microphone. "I've already sent a message through our network," Kalen replied. "Not identifying myself yet, just expressing interest in meeting with someone who shares my research background. I want her to have the choice of how and when she learns about what I've become." The wisdom in his approach struck Zephyra as profoundly parental. Even in his transformed state, even after years of separation, Kalen's primary concern was for his daughter's emotional well-being rather than his own desperate need for reunion. As their radio conversation concluded, Zephyra found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun as a quest for scientific understanding had evolved into something far more significant, a fundamental reimagining of community, identity, and hope in a world that had seemed beyond redemption. The conscious infected individuals they had contacted weren't just research subjects, they had become teachers, innovators, and bridges between different survivor communities. Their unique perspective on existence between life and death had provided insights that purely biological research never could have achieved. Yet even as their network grew and their understanding deepened, questions remained. Not all infected individuals retained consciousness, and they still hadn't determined what factors influenced the preservation of awareness. The physical deterioration continued for all the conscious infected, raising difficult questions about longevity and the future of their communities. Most poignantly, the emotional toll of their unique existence remained profound. Each conscious infected individual struggled with questions of identity, belonging, and purpose that had no easy answers. Their courage in choosing connection over isolation inspired everyone who worked with them, but it came at a cost that was impossible to fully measure. As Zephyra walked home through the settlement that had become humanity's new normal, she thought about Kalen preparing to reunite with the daughter he had never stopped loving, despite transformation that should have ended everything they had shared. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, and new questions about the nature of consciousness and survival. But tonight, she held close the knowledge that dialogue had indeed triumphed over destruction, that understanding had proven stronger than fear, and that the most peaceful zombie encounter ever seen had opened doors to possibilities none of them had dared to imagine. In a world defined by endings, they had somehow managed to create new beginnings. The path forward remained uncertain, but it was illuminated by the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit, a force that could apparently survive any transformation, overcome any obstacle, and find hope in the most impossible circumstances.